Chelsea McQueen, and my project is titled Race-Related Stress and its Relationship to Obesity Risk Behaviors in Emerging Adulthood Black American Women. This is a part of my honors thesis research, which I will be defending next week. Just a little background information. In 2009, 52.9% of Black American women over age 20 were categorized as obese. When you add in overweight women, it goes up to 75%. This is compared to 37% of Black men and 33% of white women. So our main question throughout this research is why? What is the reason for this disparity? What is it about the experience of being a Black woman in America that makes you more likely to be obese? And we think that a lot of it is perceived racism. So as Black women, the amount of racism that you'll get is different, yet hypothesized, than a Black man's. So Black men are more likely to get overt racism, maybe physical threats or racial slurs. But Black women are more likely to get a subtle racism. And we think that's in the form of microaggressions, which are very small sort of digs to you that indicate a disregard to you according to your race or ethnicity. And we think that national fitness campaigns are limited because they don't actually address the social effects of racism. They tell you maybe to eat healthy, or they tell you about shorter workout periods spread across the week so you don't actually have to be a gym maniac. But they don't tell you about very small things that affect your eating behaviors. So what we're trying to do is consider the connection between stress on a broad scale and stress on a very small scale and how that affects your eating behaviors. We looked at a couple of main theories. The first was the transactional model of stress and coping. And that looks at how people decide to cope with their stressors. There's two main waves of appraisal. The first one is just a person looking at the stressor and seeing how big it is. That's how much work it would take and also how immediate the stressor is. The second wave of appraisal is looking at how they can actually handle the stressor. Do they have the social and personal resources that they need to take care of it? So if a stressor is far away, not a big deal, and they know they can handle it, the person's going to feel a lot less stressed towards it. If it's a very big stressor and the person knows that they can't handle it at all, they don't have the resources, they're going to feel a lot more stressed towards it. And they're going to try to engage in coping mechanisms. The second theoretical framework that we used is the Index of Race-Related Stress. And that's a scale that was made in 1996. This scale looked at the amount of chronic stress as a result of racism that Black Americans experienced. And this scale would present a racist experience and ask Black Americans, one, if they had experienced it, and two, how much stress it caused if they hadn't experienced it. We think that little research has been done to examine factors contributing to maladaptive health behaviors like overeating associated with obesity risk among Black American women. So our basic idea is that if you are experiencing these things and you come back to an environment that's maybe not welcoming, that you're going to internalize these behaviors and end up overeating, which in turn leads to obesity. We had 4 main aims of the study. The first one was to explore the relationship between race-related stress and health behaviors. Now this is maladaptive, like overeating, and then adaptive, health promoting, like exercising, and that includes running, swimming, yoga, and meditation, a variety of things. The second is to determine what psychosocial variables and socio-demographic variables, in addition to race-related stress, are related to health behaviors. We looked at a lot of scales, which I'll show you later, but it included overall perceived stress, body anxiety, fitness stress. So I feel like I should be running every day and I'm not, how I feel about my body now. The third is to examine whether or not the relationship between race-related stress and health behaviors is moderated by the racial composition of the environment in emerging adulthood Black women. This is an aim that's very different than other research that's going on right now. We're looking at emerging adulthood because that's the time, age 18 to 25, that you're moving out on your own. You're creating your own habits, you're making your own decisions, and these decisions will follow you, really for the rest of your life. We looked at the environment the racial composition of the environment in the context of the college that you're at. So we only looked at university students. It could be a non-majority setting, like an HBCU, historically black college or university, or a majority setting, like a PWI, primarily white institution. Our idea is if you experience these racial microaggressions and then come back to an environment full of people that have also experienced racial microaggressions, you'll feel differently about them and you might not engage in maladaptive health behaviors like overeating. And our second is to explore whether coming of age in a non-majority setting, like an HBCU, is related to obesity risk behaviors in recent alumni. This touches on what I said before about how habits are formed during the college age and then continue on as you graduate and go into the workforce. Right, and here's a copy of our conceptual model. We looked at how race-related stress is affected by the racial composition of the environment to change your health behaviors, and that can go into maladaptive behaviors like mood-based eating and adaptive behaviors like exercise. So we had 179 Black American women aged 18 to 25 to complete our online survey. The median age was about 21. All participants were either currently attending the four-year college or university, and that was our main sample, or they had recently graduated, and that's our alumni sample. Approximately 75% of participants were from primarily white institutions, while the other 25% were from a historically black college or university. It's actually a pretty good percentage. And the participants represented 119 colleges and universities from 32 states, so this is nationwide. Our main source of recruitment was actually from the Tumblr blog, entitled Black Girl Strong. There's a lot of fitness inspiration blogs around that people use to kind of motivate them. It rarely works, but to motivate them to eat healthier, to work out. But not a lot are actually dedicated to Black American women, so we tried to help fill that void. Black American women in general are very distrusting of giving their information to just authority in general. So we use this as a way to kind of build a rapport with the community. So we gave recipe advices, ways to work out, motivational sayings, and we just sort of built a place in the community so they felt more comfortable with talking to us. We even told them that it was part of an experiment. This is something that we're doing. Don't worry, you can contact us with any questions, but this is who we are. This is what this blog is for. We actually amassed a pretty large following. Maybe 200 people were looking at the blog regularly. We had a lot of web hits every day. And as you see at the bottom, like, P.S., take our survey. There was a constant barrage of like, take our survey, please talk to us, let's go. You see an example of a recruitment post that they would get maybe like 3 times a day would pop up on their feeds. Please take our survey, we'll pay for your textbooks. And we saw that it was about health and wellness, so we didn't actually tell them exactly what it was about, but we were pretty transparent about this survey. So we looked at a multitude of measures. So we really wanted to understand just the entire landscape of these women. We wanted to know everything that they were feeling. So we looked at stress, psychosocial well-being, and health fit behavior. Of stress, we looked at perceived stress, just how stressed you feel in general, and race-related stress, using the model that we discussed earlier. Perceived stress scale just said things like, I feel like I don't have enough time to do everything that I need to, or sometimes my responsibilities are piling up and I don't know what to do. For psychosocial well-being, we used a depression scale, which can be used for depressive symptoms, but also for actual depression. Here we just used it for symptoms. And for health fit behaviors, we used a multitude of things, including a social fatigue anxiety scale, which had things like, I feel nervous when I know other people are evaluating my body, or sometimes I choose not to expose my stomach or legs because I'm afraid of what other people think. And the eating habit scale, which talked a lot about emotional eating. Like, food is a friend to me. Sometimes when I'm feeling stressed, I might snack a little more often. And as for our results, our first research aim was to investigate the relationship between race-related stress and health behavior. we saw that race-related stress was positively and moderately related to emotional eating and also exercise machine use. For our second aim, we ran a hierarchical linear regression to understand what psychosocial, demographics, and socio-demographic variables sort of attributed to that behavior. And we actually found that weight, body anxiety, and perceived stress were enough to explain that behavior. So race-related stress did not actually hold an effect above and beyond those other variables. Our third aim, we wanted to see if race-related stress was moderated by the racial composition of the environment. We found that the only thing HBCU attendance was related to in undergraduates was running and jogging. And for our fourth aim, we found that alumni of HBCUs that were low in body anxiety and were experiencing race-related stress were more likely to engage in yoga and meditation as a coping mechanism than women that went to a primarily women institution. So, what does that mean? For race-related stress and its relationship to obesity in Black American women, we found that it did actually have an effect. So Black American women are feeling stress related to their race, and they're eating emotionally because of it. We think that that has a lot of implications for more culturally tailored health intervention strategies. So if you know that something very specific is hitting Black American women and making them eat more, you can give them something more than just, try to eat more quinoa, or go up the stairs instead of using the elevator. If you're able to focus on why they're actually doing things, you're able to help them more. For HBCU attendance, you'll see that only running and jogging were related positively for HBCUs, but we found that a lot of very visible health behaviors were actually negatively related to attendance at a primarily white institution. So running outside was negatively related, swimming was negatively related, even exercise machine use like at a gym was negatively related to being at a majority school. And we think that says a lot about the level of comfort that a Black American woman might feel in the environment of a primarily white institution, but also the level of safety that they feel. So all of these things are pretty solitary activities. Running outside as a Black American woman in a primarily white institution environment might make you feel more on display. You might feel less safe or even just more visible than you would when you're at a historically Black institution. Additionally, there's been a lot of research about just physical attractiveness and how you feel when you're running and sweating. And at a primarily white institution, you might get questions about like your hair looked one way before you went running, and now it looks completely different. What's going on? Whereas in an HBCU, other people have these problems. Other people's hair changes. Other people look a certain way when they sweat, and you don't feel like you're a representation of your race at that place. For alumni and coping mechanisms, we saw that Black American women that attended HBCUs were more likely to engage in very adaptive health behaviors after experiencing race-related stress. So if I went to an HBCU and I felt like someone had just sort of sucker punched me very subtly, but still I'm feeling it, I'm more likely to go back to my house and maybe meditate or engage in yoga instead of watching Netflix and eating a pizza. I'm more able to sort of understand that imbalance and attribute that to what I'm feeling, and try to have an adaptive response to it. Now, this only works for women that have low body anxiety. You'll find that in general, women that have low body anxiety are much more likely to do things like engage in yoga or swim. That's a bad one. But instead of running on an exercise machine, very high intensity cardio sort of things. Any questions?
Chelsea, How do you feel about that term microaggression? Because I just think they're really aggressions, and so can you kind of talk about that term? Does that feel, do you think that's an appropriate term?
I think it is an appropriate term. There are actually 3 types of microaggressions, and this is a term pioneered by DWSU. So there are micro-invalidations, micro-assaults, and micro-insults. There we go, thanks. So micro-assaults are the only ones that are actually like very purposely made. Like, I'm saying this to you to hurt you. And those include racial slurs. But the other ones, they're so small and there's such variance that I think the best term is an aggression. They're very, very small aggressions, and they're usually not purposeful at all. So I like the term. Yes.
Were any of your respondents at women's colleges on either side, HBCU or PWIs?
I'm sorry?
Were any of them at all women's colleges?
Yes.
Okay.
So I know for a fact I got Spelman and Meredith, and those are the only ones that are jumping out at me. And I would like to see the difference. Maybe if going to a women's college makes you feel less anxiety about your body. But when we controlled for a lot of things when we were just looking at our data and playing around, and we found that there was actually not a lot of changes in body anxiety if you went to an HBCU or PWI, which was really surprising because the ideal body is very different in those two types of institutions. So stereotypically, Black Americans are more likely to like a thicker body, less or more fat. And so we would think that Black American women would actually feel less body anxiety in that situation where it's like, it's okay for me to be a little heavier, it's fine. But we actually found the same amount of anxiety in those 2 conditions, sort of confirming that maybe you're just gonna feel a lot of anxiety if you don't fit this perfect mold anyway, no matter what that is. So I can feel like at a women's college, it'll just be more comparative to other women instead of comparison to what the ideal man would want.
So in other words, the broader cultural norms have a stronger role even than the environment in which you're surrounded by people who are more accepting.
And then we'll move to our next speaker perhaps, and then if there are additional questions, time at the end, right, just to make sure everybody has time before we run out.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Thank you for coming out on this rainy day. Try to dress up a little bit like the sun to help you guys out. So, today is Africa Wear Wednesday, so just trying to represent a little bit as part of Africa Week. And so my talk today is about achieving the Senegalese dream, transnational narratives from Dakar and New York City. This is part of my honors in Lumen research as well, so I will be defending my research as well and then also presenting on Saturday. Okay. All right, so just a little significance and some terms that I'll be using throughout the talk that I want to frame a little bit. And so the idea of migration and transnationalism. So historically, the idea of migration has been you pick up from one part of the world, you move to the other part of the world, and that's it. That's where the story ends, beginning, middle, end. But with transnationalism, which is a term that was coined back in the 90s, late 80s, is the term used to really describe what migration looks like more today. Because what it is that you get up, move to a different country, but you're still in touch with the people that you left behind. Perhaps you still have family and friends back there, perhaps you send them remittances, or perhaps it's just a nostalgia that you feel connected to that country. You still call that country home. And so that makes you more transnational. And perhaps you even visit often. You don't stay rooted in your host nation. And so that idea of transnationalism is what anthropologists and sociologists and other scholars have really been working with these days. And so the reason why I picked Senegal, other than it being a very convenient study abroad location, is that it is a very active sending nation. So a lot of Senegalese, there's a lot of Senegalese diasporas around the world, particularly in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, France, Italy, Spain. And so they're just a very visible community of migrants. They're very good about organizing themselves, having associations, having cultural displays, and things of that nature. And also, there's a culture of migration in Senegal. There's this idea that, there's said that there's this idea that everyone wants to get abroad, that everyone knows someone who's abroad, and that's what everyone's working towards. Part of this is because of the Senegal's history and the way that unemployment is very high right now, and it's been for a while, ever since the IMF imposed the structural adjustment and government was not able to hire people. People were going to school, and usually going to school meant you could get a job within the public sector, within the government, or teaching or things like that. But with the structural adjustment demands put on the Senegalese government, there were a lot of budgetary cuts, and so there were just no jobs available. And all the migrants who were going abroad, like in the 80s and the late 70s, they would go abroad and make money very quickly. They would come back and like display their wealth, and so that really played on the imagination of a lot of the youth at that time, and lots of people started going abroad, and people were leaving either like low-paying government jobs, or people who had no jobs at all but had been college educated were now getting up and migrating as well. And so it just makes Senegal a very right place for studying transnationalism. And then of course, I'm picking narratives in particular because in understanding people's life's histories, understanding people's experiences, it's really important to get to their narrative. That's how their words and their ideas and their experiences are able to come to the forefront. And so that's why I chose narratives in particular. And so through personal narratives where I'm telling you what happened to me, these are my experiences, that would be a personal narrative. A secondhand narrative would be, oh, my older brother, he's abroad, this is what he's doing, this is what he told me he's doing. And so I'm sharing that story with somebody else. It becomes a secondhand narrative. It's not mine, but it's someone that I heard. And so moving past that, it becomes a third hand, and then once it's a little bit like far ahead, it's like more of like a legend, and it's like, I heard that this one person did this one thing. And then a general experience narrative is when it's like, oh, everybody moves abroad, and like they'll get money from their mom, and their mom helps them move abroad, and then they do this and that when they're abroad, and that's a general experience narrative. There's not a specific person that you're talking about in that narrative. You're just saying that this is what people do in general. And then discourse, of course, is just, opinions and the words we hear and various things that are happening, but that might not be what we would call like a packaged narrative, like beginning, middle, end, like something like that. And so some of the scholars that I am in conversation with, as I go through my research, there has been definitely a handful of research done on Senegalese migrants. Like I said, they're very visible. They're a very interesting population to study. So Bruno Riccio, that Tom actually met in Italy, has written a lot about Senegalese migrants in Italy. And so his work is one that aligns with the most with mine. A lot of people who study Senegalese migrants end up talking a lot about the remittances and economic migrants and things of that nature, and I was looking a little bit more broader about the social construction of migrants. So Riccio talks a little bit about that. He does concentrate on economic migrants a little bit more, but he does a good job of looking at both sides of the migration process, like I do. Whereas Beth Bugenhagen, she looks more at Senegalese families in Senegal that have someone abroad, and so how migration changes the family dynamic because of that missing migrant, or because of the money that comes in because of the migrant, things of that nature. And then Ousmane Khan did a great piece about Little Senegal, which is the Senegalese enclave in New York City that I did part of my research in as well. And so he just kind of talks about the history of Little Senegal, how it came to be, and things of that nature. And so I'm able to build on the research of these migrants, of these scholars, but then also kind of see where mine diverse from theirs. And I'll show you guys that. All right, so some of the driving questions as part of my research was understanding, the root of my project was to understand the social construction of migrants and migration, particularly through narratives. And so some of those driving questions are, what are the lived experiences of Senegalese migrants and their families as they navigate the transnational sphere? And the transnational sphere is everything encompassed within the migration process. It is the place, the descending context, where you're coming from, and then where you're going, the process in between, and everything that's affected by you migrating. And then you understand that through people's stories, through their lived experiences. And so then what are the themes and patterns that we find in these experiences? What are the connections that we're making? The person who went to France, the person who went to Italy, the person who went to the US, what are the themes and patterns in these stories about migrating? And then what are the expectations of migrants and their families? How are those expectations constructed? How do they affect the migrant? How do they affect the family? And then how do these compare to the realities that they face? Which is why it was so important for me to talk to both sides of the ocean. And then where, how, and with whom and for what purposes are these stories shared? how do these stories move around? What do they end up doing? Why do they get shared in the ways that they get shared? So it's all of that we're looking at, but might not get answered today. It's a lot. And so a little bit about my methodology. I'm an international studies major, but my mentor is based in anthropology and sociology. So I did a lot of ethnographic research, which is participant observation. So that's me right there, participating and observing. And then also a lot of semi-formal interviews with key informants and then the people that they introduced me to and things of that nature. And then again, like I said, I did multi-setting research, which means that I spent 6 months in Senegal talking to people who have family and friends who lived abroad. And then I also spent 2 months in New York City getting plugged into the Senegalese community there and talking to people who are like directly in the middle of the Senegalese community, but also like in the peripherals of it as well. And then once I collected all those interviews, did my participant observation, I did some open coding and allowed the themes to emerge themselves. And so the multi-sided research is really important to have those two sides in conversation, and you'll see why in just a minute. And so the emerging themes. As far as El Dorado, this was particularly interesting because so a lot of scholarly research about migration talks a lot about El Dorado. The grass is greener on the other side. Go abroad to find your wealth. The Western nations are where you can make it big. That's where the the land of gold is. And so in the research on Senegalese migration, they talk a lot about how France or Italy or even New York, are El Dorado. You're supposed to go there to find your wealth. And so it was interesting though, when I got to Senegal, a lot of people, they brought up the idea of the US and other countries as an El Dorado, but only insofar as that was not true. And so that was very interesting that all along we're believing that this El Dorado story is the dominant narrative, the master narrative that everyone believes. But everyone who was talking to me was saying that, oh, that's not true, like the US is not an El Dorado, there's all these challenge narratives. They were telling me secondhand narratives from family and friends of, it's really hard to find a job, living conditions aren't great, and it's not what we think it is. But what was particularly interesting about how they phrased the El Dorado narrative was that everyone else believed in it. Everyone thinks that the US is an El Dorado, but I know better. My cousin told me this, and it's not true. And so it's just so interesting so in that way, El Dorado was still acting as the dominant narrative, the master narrative that they then referenced their personal experience from, or their cousin's experience, and now their experience as someone who knows better, that El Dorado is not true, And so it's interesting because it still made El Dorado come to the forefront, made El Dorado the master narrative that they were then rebutting. And so that was particularly interesting. And then so off that idea of an El Dorado narrative, people in New York, so everyone in Senegal is saying, I know that it's hard abroad, migrants don't have it as easy as we think they have it, things of that nature. And in my research, I'm finding that a lot of people attribute that to the idea that everyone still believes in the El Dorado narrative. They attribute that to how the US represents itself in movies. The way the US always shows fast cars and beautiful women and all these things. And so that continues to play on the imagination of people thinking they should go. And then there's also this idea of migrants who come back pretending they have achieved the El Dorado narrative because they think everyone expects them to achieve the El Dorado narrative. So they come back being like, I have achieved it. I found the El Dorado, look at all my money. I'll pay for this and pay for that and pay for that. And so these migrants who come back ostentatiously, they also play on the imagination of people who are thinking of going abroad or thinking about what the US and other nations look like. And then also, so in the past, it used to be that it was easy to get abroad, but nowadays with immigration and immigration laws around the US and the economic crisis throughout, it's getting harder, but a lot of people were saying, I don't think a lot of people realize that the economic crisis is happening around the world, but I realize that because my cousin told me, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And so everyone was just trying to yes, El Dorado maybe sort of used to exist, but definitely does not exist anymore. And that's what I think. And so these were the people in Senegal. And so when I was in New York, everyone was like, yeah, everyone at home thinks that there's an El Dorado, but there's not. And so it was just interesting that everyone in Senegal was like, we know there's no El Dorado, blah, blah, blah. But then everyone in New York was like, everyone in Senegal believes that, I'm really rich right now. And so for the migrants who are in New York, they felt really pressured pressured. They were like, everyone in my family thinks that I have a lot of money right now, that I'm living large, and that I got a job as soon as I got here, but that's not the case. And so it's just really interesting how everyone pushes this El Dorado narrative on other people and saying that they don't believe in it, and then the migrants all feel that everyone in Senegal believes in the El Dorado narrative, even the people who are like, no, I don't believe in it. So just very, very interesting, a lot of moving parts as far as how this narrative moves, who owns the narrative, who actually believes in the narrative, because no one I talked to was like, yeah, I definitely, think that the US is an El Dorado. So it's just very interesting. And then as far as the Senegalese dream, this is something that other scholars have identified but have never termed. And so similar to the way we have the American dream, when you say the American dream, there's a specific image that comes up, right? Nice house, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, all of that, right? And so similarly with the Senegalese dream, there was a lot of people were saying, what I want for my future is I want to have a house, a beautiful wife, and a good job, and the respect and love of my community, things of that nature. And so that is kind of what I am terming the Senegalese dream, that specific image of house, beautiful wife, good job. So it's clear that it's very gendered, and a lot of the ways that people talked about migration, even when women would talk about migration, it's all quite gendered. They the migrant is always a he. If you're going to use a generic pronoun for the migrant, migrants, they always think this, he usually does this and that, and also all the migrants get all the pretty girls and things like that. A lot of terms like that. And so in that way, for now, the Senegalese dream is quite gendered in that, it means house, beautiful wife, good job, things of that nature, and then all the social success that comes with that. And so in general, a lot of the scholarship says that migration was the success. As soon as you were a migrant, that automatically meant you would get a house, you would have a beautiful wife or beautiful wives. It's an Islamic country. It's a secular country, but 97% Muslim, and so there is polygamy. And so beautiful wives, houses, whatever. But what I was finding is that migration is really just the means to the end. Especially now when there's all these challenge narratives out there, all these counter narratives to the El Dorado narrative, having the Senegalese dream as the end goal, migration itself is no longer the end goal. Migration itself does not equate to success. And now, so a lot of people were talking about how, I don't have to go abroad if I don't need to. Maybe I'll go abroad and complete my studies, but I'm going to come back here and help my country. As long as I can have my house and my wife here and have my job, I'm good. And so it kind of opens up that Senegalese dream to non-migrants as well. You don't have to be a migrant to achieve the Senegalese dream. You don't have to enter into the transnational sphere. You can maybe get a job in the US, in Senegal as well, or start your own job. People weren't counting on the government to give them jobs at all. There were a lot of them talked about going abroad maybe and learning a few things and then coming back and starting a business or something that stimulates growth in Senegal. A lot of them talked about wanting to help their country. And so that kind of leads to my last point, which is the generation gap, and the fact that a lot of the younger generations, I got to talk to a lot of college students while I was in Senegal, and a lot of them said, the only reason I would go abroad is to finish my studies and then come back and help my country. If all of us leave, who's going to make Senegal a better place? Things of that nature. And so there was this idea that this feeling of responsibility to ensure that not everybody was leaving Senegal, that they were stimulating the economy a little bit. But everyone I talked to who was 40 and above, they were like, oh my gosh, all the young people want to leave, none of them care, they all want to go, all of them want to go abroad because they think it's an El Dorado, you know what I mean? And so you just see how all these stories, all these narratives are connected. And so then that just creates this generation gap where all the younger generation is maybe I'll go abroad, see what everyone's talking about, and then I'll come back here and help my country, this is my responsibility. And I did talk to a few people in New York as well who were either studying here or had started a small business in the US, and they were also interested in taking it back to Senegal. So we'll see how that goes. And so with that, some of the applications of this research that I'm thinking is following through with those students and those young adults who really want to help their country. How can governments and NGOs and nonprofit groups and so community-based organizations, how can they tap into that energy, that wish to go back and help my country? What can we do with those narratives? Let's not just study these narratives, let's use those narratives to move forward, let's make them realities. And then also finding ways to bridge the disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation, but also the disconnect that I was talking about across the ocean, where everyone at home is say, no, I understand that it's very hard abroad, that migrants, do have it hard, all these things, but then migrants still feel a lot of pressure. They still feel that everyone at home does not understand how hard it is for them in the US, or all the things that they're going through, or that they can't send home money all the time because they have bills and transportation, and just things are very expensive in the US and other Western nations. And so how do we bridge that disconnect between the expectations and the realities that people are facing, but then also the disconnect between the ways, the patterns of migration and how migration is today, and then also our immigration laws. The way our immigration laws reflect people who want to get up, move, and that's it. But the way that migration works today, that's not how it works. And so why aren't our immigration laws cut up with the way that people want to migrate? So, questions?
Does Senegal allow for dual citizenship? Because I know like Ghana, South Africa, Egypt, a number of countries have tried to address this going away, and by
I believe they don't. And yeah, they don't. And it's actually like really hard for people to even like get Senegalese migration. And they actually recently changed the rule. So what it is, it used to be that like if you're a woman and you marry a non-Senegalese person, your kids automatically did not get Senegalese citizenship. And if you're a man, it did. But if you were a woman, your kids would get your husband's citizenship. But they recently made it that if you're a woman and you marry a non-Senegalese man, your kids can have your citizenship if you want them to. But I believe you can't get dual citizenship in Senegal.
I have one question. Did you find that there are more women that leave versus men?
Oh, so it was mostly men, like predominantly men. And today we're starting to see women come a little bit more often. And so it was definitely mainly a male endeavor. And so you just like leave your wife for 15, 20 years maybe if you couldn't come back, based on money or because you stayed on an expired visa. Once you leave, you can't go back to the US or something like that. And it was actually interesting because this was mostly Khan's work. He found that when he was talking to people in New York, a lot of them didn't want to bring their wives over because the U.S. spoils women. They get this idea of freedom and liberation, and they call the police on their they call the police on their husbands for no good reason. And so when I talked to people in New York, they said similar things too, and even one or two girls were saying that, like, oh yeah, some girls, they come to the U.S. and they all like, oh, woman power, and they do things that they really wouldn't back home. But no one really talked about women who call their husbands call the police for legitimate reasons. Everyone was just like, oh, they call their husbands for no good reason. But there is incidences of abuse within couples in New York and other Senegalese diasporas, because especially, so with the way when Senegalese women first started coming abroad, they were coming, to join their husbands and maybe like help cook and clean and things like that. But it turns out that hair braiding is very, very lucrative. And so a lot of women found jobs in hair salons and braiding hair, but it's also a very tasking job. You're on your feet the whole time, you're braiding. You might work from morning till night, however long it takes to finish one head of hair, which can take 3 to 5 hours. And so these women would have those responsibilities outside the home, and then they would come home, and their husband, who has either worked the same amount of hours or even less, because maybe he's like a taxi driver or something, they'll both get home, and then she's expected to continue cooking and cleaning and whatever. And so it does create a lot of tension within the Senegalese household abroad. And then also now she's making her own money, and so the husband's like, no, you're supposed to give me the money you make, and she's like, no, I want to keep it for myself. And so like there's all these tensions within couples abroad. So it's very interesting. But yeah, now that like hair braiding is so lucrative and gender norms are changing just a little bit, there's definitely more women coming abroad, and even for studies as well, but definitely still very male dominated, and also why the language around it is still very male dominated.
In terms of additional questions, we'll save them for the end again, so we have time for the next speaker.
Okay, so I definitely commend both of you for not using note cards, but I'm going again. I have a lot of stuff going on here. So my project is called Deep Like the Sea and Strong Like the Earth, exploring the ideal partner characteristics of young adult heterosexual Black women. My name is Brenda Reavis, and this is also for my honors thesis, which I will also be defending this week. Okay, so my ideal partner is someone I can grow with, someone that allows me to be myself and has a positive impact on my life. This is a quote that we got from a 19-year-old Black female currently in a relationship. And my mentor loves to start qualitative presentations off with just a little example of some of the work that we were using and a lot of the examples from what we've been working with. So just to give you kind of a feel of what some of the people were saying and kind of how we've been using the research ourselves. So this is just a general overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm not really going to go super into detail with that. And then theoretical framework. So my project was based a lot in evolutionary psychology, but two of the main theories that we used were the marriage market theory, which kind of evaluates how people decide to get married, what goes into how they decide who they want to marry, so what kinds of traits, what are they looking for at a certain period of their life, and maybe how that might change depending on where they are in their life. And then also the status cask exchange theory, which is really about supply and demand and resources that a partner can offer and resources that can be exchanged. So just for some background, research indicates that only 52% of Black American women will marry by age 30 compared to 81% of white American women. Research also shows that Black American women prefer a partner of the same race, which may contribute to lower and later marriage rates due to a steady gender ratio imbalance, as well as due to some factors that disproportionately affect Black American men, such as incarceration and early death rates, unemployment rates, and lower educational attainment. These sort of factors take Black men out of the pool of eligible partners and make finding an ideal partner especially hard for Black women. And an inability to find an ideal partner correlates with an increase of sexual partners over the life course, thus exposing Black American women to health risks. So my study was really kind of looking at one overarching question. If Black American women perceive that their marriage market is limited, do they alter the trait that they're looking for in a male partner? So what sort of traits won't Black American women compromise on, and what effect might that have on their partnership? So we had 3 specific aims. The first was to uncover the characteristics that highly educated Black American women look for in an ideal partner. The second was to determine if the majority of traits reported by these Black women are characteristic of social and emotional support desires or financial support. And then the third is to investigate how the perception of partner availability is related to the traits that Black women choose. The method, we did a 5 to 10 minute anonymous online survey that was created through Qualtrics in the spring of 2013. Initial recruitment for participation used social sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr, which we didn't have an actual blog, but what we did was we sought out certain blogs that focused on things that might be relevant to Black American women, such as natural hair care. And then the survey was posted on those, or I went and asked the people who ran the blog if they would be willing to post it on their blogs, which worked out really well, actually. And women completed questions on demographics, sexual health history, and relationship characteristics, all within the last 12 months. And then content analysis and iterative coding was used for the first level of assessing the qualitative data, and grounded theory was used to craft the themes across the responses. And then, so our participant demographics were 127 non-married, heterosexually active emerging adult women with the mean age of 23, ages range from 18 to 29. 53.5% of participants were single, and 46.5% were currently enrolled in college. And our results. So what we ended up doing was, in order to identify the dominant patterns in these women's responses, we came up with 8 categories based on a review of relevant literature and in vivo coding, so based in the responses that we got as well. And these were the 8 categories. We had financial stability, ideology, personality, physical, potential for success, relationship readiness, social support, and trust honesty. And these are just some examples of responses that ended up coded within those categories, just so that you can kind of understand what these women were saying. So the first qualitative question that we analyzed was, describe your ideal male partner. Women were able to say whatever they wanted. They could write 3 things, they could write 30 things, and I coded all of them. And this is the breakdown for the ideal partner overall. The top 3 categories that emerged were personality, so someone who is loving, understanding, patient, and faithful. Physical, someone tall, 6'3" to 6'5", buff, dark skin, and good looking, and potential for success, so someone with ambition, drive, and goals, and someone who is well educated. Sounded pretty great to me. And then the second qualitative question that we pulled was, list your top 3 must-have characteristics when considering a potential male relationship partner. And for this, you could only write 3 responses, thank goodness. And this was the breakdown for the must-have traits. They were very similar. There was only one real small deviation, and the top 3 categories that emerged were exactly the same. The order in which they emerged was different. So number 1 was still personality, looking for someone loyal, communicative, and compassionate. And number 2, this time, was potential for success. So someone interested in higher learning, no criminal record, and has goals. And then for the last was physical. So someone with good teeth, dark medium skin, of course, just someone good looking. And just for recap, for ideal partner, it was personality, physical, potential for success. So the order just changed a little bit. So for our second level analysis, we wanted to get at the participant's perception of the actual marriage market. To do that, we dichotomized variables based on 2 quantitative questions using a median split. This is a lot of information, so I'm going to try to break it down so that we can understand. So for perceived balance, the question that we used was, how balanced do you think the ratio of dateable eligible men compared to dateable eligible women is? This was on a scale of 0 to 6, and the median split was at 3. So responses that were below 3 were coded as low perceived balance, and responses above 3 were coded as high perceived balance. And in this instance, high perceived balance meant that there are plenty of men to go around, and low perceived balance was that men are scarce. And for low perceived balance, the top 3 ideal and top 3 must-haves still reflected the overall trend of personality, physical, potential for success. But for high perceived balance, it also reflected the overall trend except for an ideal partner, where social support emerged as the 3rd most popular response. Now for racial dating preference, this one was, how strongly do you prefer to date men that share your ethnic racial background? Again, on a scale of 0 to 6, and the median was 5. So anything below 5 was coded as low racial preference, and above was high racial preference. And high racial preferences, I would ideally be with a man of my same race. And low racial preference was, it doesn't really matter. And for high racial preference, it reflected the overall trend except for in must-haves, where trust honesty became the 3rd most popular response. And then for low racial preference, again, reflected overall trend except for in must-haves, where ideology was the 3rd most popular response. And then for the 3rd level of analysis, we took those women's responses and we determined what we wanted the widest marriage market to be and the most narrow marriage market, so on either side of the spectrum. And we decided that the widest marriage market was high perceived balance with low racial preference, and there were 31 responses, and these reflected the overall trend except for in the must-haves, where ideology again emerged as the most popular response. And then in the most narrow marriage market, we decided that was low perceived balance and high racial preference. And there were 33 responses, and this again reflected the overall trend except for an ideal partner, where the 3rd most popular category was social support. So some of the emerging themes that we pulled. The first was a companionship narrative. So an example of a response that we thought really captured this was from a 21-year-old single Black female who said, her ideal partner was someone who's my best friend and partner. He understands that I'm not perfect and still accepts me for me. The companionship for us was a combination of the personality, ideology, and social support categories. So for this, these women were looking for someone to be there for them, someone to support them. Essentially, they wanted someone to grow old with. The next was an investment potential narrative. So someone who is well educated, has a career, and is looking for a serious relationship that will lead to marriage. This one was a combination of financial stability and potential for success. When considering the age group of this population, it makes a little bit more sense because they're all in their early 20s, and a lot of them were also pursuing higher education on their own. It made a little bit more sense that they weren't looking for someone who was already established, but they wanted someone who would also be striving for those goals with them. And then the last was this tall, dark, and handsome, which was based entirely on the physical category. So this 21-year-old single Black female said her ideal partner was tall. That's really tall to me. I don't know about you guys. But dark skin and good looking. We had responses that went as far as saying they wanted a man with a chunky beard. And for this one, we kind of took it as being attractive is important, but there's definitely a certain type of attractive that's important to these women. It's not just the overall standard of male attractiveness. Skin color did come up a lot. A certain build came up a lot. So for conclusions and implications, overall we found that partnership for Black American women was driven primarily by companionship and compatibility rather than that financial support component. We also found a really interesting part was like an importance of an emotional security component for these Black American women. In previous research, I found a little piece about a getting to know period being especially crucial to determining a long-term partner. It's just a period to determine if a woman is comfortable enough to be herself within her relationship dynamic. So it's even above physical safety at that point. It's just about knowing that they are emotionally safe with their partner and that their needs are going to be taken into account. And then the last was a real challenge to a lot of stereotypical depictions of Black women's partnership aspirations. Unfortunately, while representation has increased for Black American women, a lot of it still falls within the same kind of caricatures of the gold digger or the Jezebel. Very two-dimensional, not a lot to go, not a lot of depth for these characters. So I feel like our research really kind of showed that for Black American women, there's a lot more to choosing a partner than finding someone who's going to give you a meal ticket. And then something that for future consideration, I think that this research is really good for looking at how to teach healthy relationships. A lot of what we see now is about how to make sure that you'll be sexually healthy with your partner and how to be sure that you'll be physically healthy with your partner. But this research doesn't quite take into account maybe what Black women are thinking about when they're going into relationships. So I think it would be a really interesting usage of this information of kind of framing some of those conversations a little bit differently. And then, of course, informing larger discussions about public health issues for Black women. As I said earlier, because of an inability to find an ideal partner, you might be more likely to have more sexual partners, which could lead to an increase of your exposure to STIs and HIV specifically. So something really interesting to consider is how does the power dynamic in a relationship affect partner selection and retention techniques? So if Black American women aren't finding their ideal, are they willing to settle for certain characteristics that might be less desirable? Are they willing to compromise some of their beliefs and some of what they do know about their sexual health in order to keep that partner? And that's it.
We have another 10 minutes for questions for any of our three speakers. And
the persuasion is particularly challenging for straight Black women, and then it seems like their ideal is a unicorn. So, you know, like that's a really specific ideal. Right. And so I mean, that almost seems counterintuitive to me. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's a tricky question because it's hard to say, you know, you have this very specific ideal that you want, but like too bad, you know what I'm saying? Just because of the demographic that you're in, because of what you're looking for. I think that, you know, we all have our childhood fantasies of what our ideal male is, or female, whatever it's gonna look like, or act like, or whatever. But I think that this research is particularly important because it focuses on this demographic, and a lot of research does not. A lot of the past research that we pulled looked primarily at women who are lower socioeconomic status, so that's probably why that financial gain narrative came up so frequently. But I think that, honestly, this is really only a jumping point. It's more of a frequency count rather than a real like in-depth analysis, which would be a really interesting way to answer that question, I think.
So we have a comment.
No, it was good, seriously. I'm older, but we loved it. I loved it, but I sat here and I was telling Shantae, we need one of these for older women, you know?
Yeah, I wonder if that unicorn changes when the age demographic changes.
I think so. A little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not so tall, dark, and handsome.
It's different.
Mm-hmm.
As
Yeah,
you
that's
get
definitely
older.
something that we talked about, especially for future directions. I think that we ended up with this number we ended up with just by chance, really. We didn't
That's a
really.
good idea. It was
We didn't really go into it saying well, this age group in particular, but when that started being the majority of responses, that's what we stuck with. And it's a very interesting period to be studying anyway, but I definitely do think there's a lot of questions to be asked about what happens as you move up a little bit, and comments, I've gotten a similar comment before and other times that I've presented, and it's the same response that it definitely does change, but how? And I think that'd be really interesting to look at.
It'd also be interesting to see what the ideal partner for males in the same demographic would be. So that's what I was thinking. I was like,
Do you have any questions regarding your respondents' interest in marriage and kind of their ideal, or if you were to continue on, if you don't have anything like this, kind of their ideal point for when they think that they would be interested in getting married? Because these are very young women,
Right.
And so some of the questions kind of assume that they're very interested in marrying, which very well may be the case, but you may find some differences in what that unicorn looks like, right? Like, because it's something that they see as kind of far off.
Right.
And so you can have these dreams, right? But then when you get a little closer to perhaps when you're ready to get married, your ideas and ideals might be shifting at that point. Or it might be that you're very interested in getting married and you want to get that guy that you want, and your market is very small. So that would be another interesting aspect to take a look at.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think we have any particular questions in the survey that said, like, are you trying to get married right now? You know what I'm saying? But I do know that there was a question that kind of was aimed at trying to decide if you were thinking about this from a casual partner versus a very long-term partner perspective. And we kind of took that along with the information about what we know about Black women who are trying to get their degree, and the fact that everyone is marrying a lot later now, to kind of segue into that marriage partner rather than the casual partner. But yeah, I think that would be definitely an interesting direction to be like that specific, like if you were going to get married, what are you looking for?
I think this would really have, and I think you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but really interesting and important applications to women's healthcare and the way that Black women are targeted in healthcare, and not targeted to some extent. And that, because a lot of the rhetoric is kind of focused, it's very embodied rhetoric, it's focused on STD rate and things like that, and very assumptive in terms, it has a lot of assumptions in terms of demographic and lifestyle behaviors and things like that. And very non-representative and misrepresentative generally, but maybe like refocusing the language toward the kind of emotional, supportive kind of aspect of things, and then as a postscript, the kind of STD, like more embodied, more clinical language, and as a better way of kind of reaching the demographic that I think healthcare specialists are trying to reach and just don't know how to. And so I think showing them that kind of research would be really interesting.
I think that would be really interesting. I mean, I think it's definitely an issue with how healthcare is currently, especially for women. But I do think that the approach does have a lot to do with it. And even in doing this, like some of the research that I found about that emotional security component being so important, like I have to feel comfortable with this person to be completely myself. Before the physical state, before like the sexual health really kind of came up, that getting to know period was just so crucial to those women. So I definitely do think framing it as like, what does a healthy relationship, a comprehensive healthy relationship look like? And then kind of going into, making sure that you're thinking about anything having to do with possible abuse, assault, any kind of thing like that. And then also, what does it look like sexually? So I think more of a narrative that people can maybe relate to would definitely be helpful.
Did you find the coding difficult? Because I can see for example, when it said intelligent and you put it as personality instead of sort of something about success, likeliness for success or something, I was kind of like, ooh, that'd be a tricky one. Where do you put that?
Yeah, so we did in vivo coding. So it was, I would take all of the data, code it myself, bring it to the mentor. We do like sections at a time because it was a lot. I'd bring it to my mentor, she'd go over it, she'd code it. We'd sit together in the office, coding each response one at a time. So, and we consulted a lot of other resources. Like we pulled a whole list of personality traits, it's like 600 or something, in order to determine what would be categorized as personality versus, because we did have issues with that, like potential for success or even physical. Because athletic, we would have said was physical, but apparently it's personality. So, But I think there were points when it was difficult, but because it was such like an iterative process and we kept coming back to it and working very closely together on it, it went by pretty quickly.
I wanted to ask about in the free form question you had, and forgive me if you covered this and I missed it, but did anyone mention like the influence of family approval or peer approval?
I don't think so. I think anything related to family that we saw was family oriented. That was the main one that we saw, and we coded that as ideology. So, but in general, anything that might have to do with like outside influence really was religion. That was the main thing. A Christian, God-fearing man, active in his church, things like that came up.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks again to our three speakers.